evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those new to the show, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today, we're tackling a topic that's been hot in the media, even for those who are not familiar with Israeli politics. There's been a question of Israel's relations with Russia, with Ukraine, in light of Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's also been a larger question of democracy, liberalism, what's happening after the Israeli election that brought Benjamin Netanyahu back to power as prime minister, and what's happening with his controversial potential co-ministers. We are going to tackle all of this today with a special guest from Israel, Natan Sharansky. For those who are not familiar with him, he is a famous Soviet dissident leader, one of the leaders of the Soviet dissident movement, who spent many years in Soviet prisons and knows the situation in both countries better than anyone, having been born in Ukraine. He's familiar with the culture, society, and politics, both historical and contemporary. He has also spent years in Israeli government and as head of the Jewish Agency. And with us today, he's going to comment on this very interesting topic. Before I begin discussing Israel's relations with Russia and Ukraine, particularly in light of the ongoing war, I'll ask Mr. Sharansky about what he wants to highlight of his own background and his current activities and position.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. Good evening. Well, if to summarize my life, I can say that I spent 9 years in Soviet prison, 9 years in Israeli government, and 9 years as the head of Jewish Agency. But if to go more in details, I was born in 1948 in the city of Donetsk, which is today the center of the war between Ukraine and Russia. But in those days when I was born and grew in Donetsk, then it was called Stalino, if somebody will tell me that, guess, the next war here will be or between Russians and Ukrainians or between the inhabitants of Earth and the inhabitants of the other planet. Without thinking, I will say the second, because to think for a moment there can be war between Russians and Ukrainians, that was unthinkable. What's also important that I grew in the Soviet Union without any identity. As a Jew, I was deprived of any identity, of any tradition, or any knowledge about our history, of synagogue, or bar mitzvah, nothing. And without freedom, of course. Everybody was deprived of freedom in the Soviet Union. And later, there was no way that you start fighting for freedom because there were no values in your life except the value of survival. And then later, when I discovered my identity, my people, my history, and my country, that surprisingly gave me a lot of strength to fight for my rights to immigrate to Israel, for the rights of the other Jews, and then for the rights of everybody. That's how I became activist and then spokesman of two movements, this Jewish immigration movement and human rights movement. So as a result, I was accused in high treason. I was sentenced to 13 years of imprisonment. I was released after 9 years after the big campaign all over the world, led by Jewish organizations and my wife. And then came to Israel. There started the big wave of Aliyah, started after the Iron Curtain fell. And we organized the Party of New Immigrants, to help the new immigrants to be integrated. And that's how I spent 9 years in Israeli government. I can't say it was as enjoyable as in prison, because in prison everything was clear. Here are enemies, here are friends. You say no to KGB, and that's all moral choices which you have to do. In the government, it's much more complicated, but also, of course, it was very challenging and very interesting to survey people in the government. And then I became the head of Jewish Agency, which is like the main organization which keeping Israel and Jews of the world connected. And here I found new challenges of global anti-Semitism. And always, whatever I was doing, I always felt and insisted that there is deep connection between human rights and identity, because I believe that all the people in the world have two basic desires: desire to be free and desire to belong. And that's the essence of our struggle.
In light of this background, of your deep involvement with these movements, with human rights, with the rights for all the people, the current situation with the war in Ukraine must raise a lot of questions for you. But my question is something that has not been well covered even in the Jewish media, much less in the US and international media, which is, how does the Israeli society as a whole see the war, see these the current circumstances? We're hearing a lot about weapon sales and so forth, not a lot what people actually think about what's going on.
Well, first of all, Putin launched a barbaric aggression against Ukraine. In fact, last week I had an opportunity to have a short visit in Ukraine. I met with President Zelensky. I met with people who were sitting in the shelters. I saw the destruction and the war crimes of the Russian army. It's awful. And I have to say that there is a lot of sympathy and understanding in Israel, and there are many efforts of giving humanitarian help. Israel, I think, is the only country which sent the whole hospital, which worked in Ukraine for a few months and fully paid by Israeli government. There is also airplane after airplane of different humanitarian assistance. Now we are sharing our rich experience, unfortunately, in how to help the people who have trauma after the war or after all these sufferings. And there are many social workers who are teaching and helping Ukrainians. At the same time, there is one point on which I disagree with my own government, but it is important to understand. Israel until now is not giving weapons to Ukraine, though it shares more and more intelligence and other useful information. But as to the weapons, we don't want, our government and our military experts believe that we cannot break our strategic agreement with Putin. And I'll explain what I mean under this. In 2014, because of the unbelievable weakness demonstrated by American government, specifically by President Obama, when he declared that he will attack Syria if they'll use chemical weapons, and he didn't do it. Russia used it. Putin personally used it by bringing his troops to Syria and establishing here a military base and controlling practically the skies of Syria, fully controlling. As a result, and we, Israel, are in day and night, everyday fight against Iran, which declares that it's going to destroy us. So almost every day, our airplanes are attacking Iranian bases in Syria. And for this, in 2015, it was Bibi Netanyahu, and he's very proud, and correctly so, we reached an agreement with Russia that in spite of the fact that they have such strong relations with Syria and good relations with Iran, they will not interfere in our attacks on Iranian bases. And that's something what's happening almost every day. And our specialists believe, they are warned by Putin, that the moment you're giving weapons to Ukraine, we will give weapons to Syria, and you will not be able to attack these bases. So that is the official, not only official, that's the reason why our politicians and our military experts try to abstain from giving the weapons. Well, I am against this position. I think there are more and more people who are criticizing this position. And our argument is very simple. It's not simply the sympathy to the people of Ukraine, and it's not only our indignation by the barbaric aggression of Putin, but that is the struggle for the future of the free world. Putin tries to change all the principles on which free world was built after the Second World War. And we are part of this world. We want to be part of this world. We want that free world will win. So Israel, looking at the bigger picture, sooner or later we will have to assist Ukraine also in a military way. And I think now in the weeks to come, it will be easier because Russia and Iran are becoming so close, and Iran is giving its weapons to Russia, and Russia probably, there are information, probably will be sharing nuclear secrets with Iran. In this situation, we'll have no choice but to fight not only Iran, but Iranian cooperation with Russia, what means we'll have to start giving not only humanitarian assistance, but also weapons to Ukraine.
I have many uncomfortable questions to ask, and I think I would be remiss as a journalist if I didn't ask them. The primary one being the fact that Russia and Iran were allies for a very long time before this war. And experts, security experts, and even regular people on the ground have told me of a very close security relationship between the countries. The fact that Russia has been training Iranian intelligence in various techniques ranging from intelligence gathering to torture of prisoners for years before we're finding ourselves in the current situation. To what extent is it reasonable to say that Russia's position in Syria has not been in some way self-serving? In other words, Russia has not interfered simply because it had something to gain regardless. It didn't want Iran's perhaps becoming too dominant in an area of influence for Russia. And second, because at the end of the day, these operations by Israel in Syria are tactical. Their response to weapons smuggling and infrastructure, but they do not ultimately destroy the Iranian project as a whole, nor do they threaten Russia.
Well, you're absolutely wrong thinking that our struggle with Iran is a tactical one.
No. In Syria specifically.
Again, I have to go back, unfortunately, to the unbelievable weaknesses and let's say naivety of West, and especially of America, and especially in the times of Obama administration. Mm-hmm. Because Israel was warning against agreements with Iran for the last 25 years. I was in the first government of Bibi, of Netanyahu, in 1996, 97, 98, when I made my first trip to Russia, first trip after I was arrested and spent there in prison. And I had a specific task to discuss the leakage of Russian technologies to Iran. Because Iran then started developing missiles with which they can reach us, and nuclear weapons. And Iran publicly says it many times, that he's aimed to have the world without Zionism. And not only they are waiting, but they'll have nuclear weapons. They're supporting terror attacks on Israel and Jews all over the world. The famous 94 attack on the Jewish center in Argentina and many others, they are all organized and implemented by Iran. Now, when American government reached the agreement, signed agreement with Iran, in spite of many protests of Israel, what happened? It happened that hundreds of billions of dollars were given to Iran, some of them by cash. The fact that why American government would decide to give by cash hundreds of millions and then more than $1 billion to Iran, who use it directly to terrorist activity, I don't know. But the fact is that Hezbollah, the terrorist organization, which is on our borders, in Lebanon and Syria, was turned from small groups into the real army just in those years when hundreds of billions of dollars came to Iran. And Iran equipped Hezbollah today by tens of thousands of missiles, which can reach every corner of Israel. And every night, our airplanes are taking airplanes from the sea, from the air, and sometimes artillery are taking bases of the weapons which are brought just in the real time from Iran, mainly the missiles for 200 kilometers, 300 kilometers. But you have to understand, we are not America, we are not even Ukraine. We are a small country. If you have the missiles of 400 kilometers, you can reach every point in Israel. And we have to fight it. And we have to fight it in spite of the fact that West was very peaceful, tried to appease Iranian regime. Even when there was a real chance on revolution in 2009, unfortunately, America said for us, engagement with the regime is more important than the change of the regime. And I was in contact with many Iranian dissidents, and they really felt betrayed. By the way, in these very days, there is a real human rights revolution in Iran, started by women, of course, but supported now by students, trade unions. And again, well, America this time expresses some sympathy to them, but dissidents demand much more. They demand delegitimize this regime, stop making any agreements with this regime. And in spite of the fact that America now is fighting, helping to Ukraine to fight against Russia, they hope that at some moment they can have peaceful agreement with Iran. So we really, Israel, really feel that we have to fight on our own and to guarantee our survival against this enemy. And that's why, yes, we had, because Putin was given by the West, America didn't protest even, the full control over Syria. We have now to attack these bases in spite of the presence of Putin there. I believe we have to fight these bases and at the same time to help Ukraine. But our military experts all the time are looking how to guarantee our security. And I think that now more deep cooperation between America and Israel on the question of Iran can give us opportunity to be much more involved also in assisting Ukraine to fight against Russia.
Now, the question here, though, is not only military, because arguably Russia has been significantly weakened since the beginning of the war and cannot necessarily afford to fight fully on two fronts. It can still maintain presence in Syria, but it would not necessarily undertake a war against Israel, even in cases of Israel continuing to fight Iran while also helping Ukraine. Arguably, I don't see Russia's prioritizing the agreement with Israel right now when it can barely deal with its own mess in Ukraine. But the questions here are not military just because they're also ideological. The questions are, to what extent do you believe Russia and Russian lobbies have had an impact on this thinking? To what extent is this thinking that Russia is a necessary condition to fight Iran in Syria driven by military consideration? And to what extent do you think Russia, which has been lobbying heavily around the world through propaganda groups and through influence campaigns of various sorts, has had an impact on some of the politicians and political circles in Israel?
Well, I would say Russia has no influence on Israelis, but there can be always some people who came from Russia who feel some sympathy to the places from which they come. I would say overwhelmingly, by the way, Russian speaking, there is about 1 million people who came from the Soviet Union after our victory and after we brought down then Jordan. All the studies show that 90% of Russian speaking are fully on the side of Ukraine, and they are very actively involved on all types of assistance of Ukraine. There are a few who go there as soldiers after they served in Israeli army, of course, it's a small percentage, but the sympathy is clear. Now, yes, it's true that Russia demonstrated, I think Putin was surprised how weak and corrupt his army is. And that may be the best news for the world which we got. And I do hope that now the free world will be much less appeasing to Russian dictatorship than before. But having said this, I have to say that, again, Israel is a very small country. And Russia having this base in 2015 without any resistance from the free world, changed fully stations in the Middle East. In fact, every airplane which starts from our airfields can be controlled by this Russian base in Syria, again, because you have to control on 300-400 kilometers. And Putin makes it very clear. If you give Ukraine weapons how to attack our airplanes, we'll give immediately Syria and will help to Syria how to attack your airplanes. And that's a threat, and we have to take this threat seriously. I do believe that we have to deal with this and not to be blackmailed and to give military assistance to Ukraine as well as to other parts of the free world who are under attack. But again, it's not some kind of political invention. It's real strategic question that Israel, not like most of the other countries. Today it's Israel and Ukraine. We have to fight for our existence from 1948. And we discovered again and again that we have, in order to survive in the Middle East, we have to rely on our own army. And that's why we are making all these researches and inventing new types of weapons, unique weapons to protect our skies. And I think now the time has come that we will protect our skies, but also will find the way to help the Ukrainians to protect their skies.
To that extent, we have heard Benjamin Netanyahu say prior to the elections that he would review the request by Ukraine to provide defensive and other weapons. What did he mean by that? What would that review process look like?
First of all, the fact that Israeli politician says it before elections, it by itself shows where the sympathy of public opinion is. And as I said, not everybody, but overwhelming majority of Israelis are on the side of Ukraine. And many of them, like me, want that not only will give humanitarian assistance, which we give a lot, but and some logistic assistance and some intelligence assistance, but we'll give them a real weapon first. Second, first of all, we'll see in the next couple of weeks, there will be emerging new government, and we'll see what it will be. I recently met with President Zelensky, and we analyzed together the same situation. Of course, he is very hopeful, and I'm trying to help to the extent I can in the communication between our countries. About Bibi Netanyahu, we have to understand, on one hand, he is the one who reached that really historic, important agreement with Putin, that in spite of the fact that Putin now is maybe the only real power in the Middle East, unfortunately, Americans retreated and agreed that Russia will take over control over Syria, that in spite of this, he reached this agreement, and our airplanes are attacking Iranian bases in Syria. And on the other hand, Bibi is the one who did more than anybody in the world to warn about Iranian threat. For the last 25 years, he was the first who started organizing financial sanctions and many other things, and preparing Israel to attack Iran if necessary, and organizing some big intelligence operations and so on. So for him, the fact that Russia becomes today the main ally of Iran can play a very important role in his decision to start assisting Ukraine military. That's what, well, we'll have to see, of course, but I'm cautiously optimistic.
To what extent can Ukraine be of value as an ally to Israel on the Iran issue?
Well, Ukraine by itself can, though I have to say, well, just now it occurred to me, in the end of 90s, Israel was very concerned that Iran was building nuclear reactors. And the agreements were made with the Soviet Union. But now Soviet Union fell apart. From 91, it didn't exist. And it was Russia and Ukraine who were building different parts of this reactor. And we asked both of the countries to cancel this agreement. And Russia refused. I met with the leaders of Russia and Ukraine, and Russia said, France is doing it, Germany is helping them. Why we should not have this business? And Ukraine, President Kuchma told me after some discussion that they decided to stop delivering, to cancel the contracts. And they are losing thousands of working places, but they believe it's important. And I remember how with excitement, it was 98, I called to Al Gore, Vice President of America, who was controlling these things and with whom I was in dialogue, to say it. And America, he said, oh, of course, we are very grateful. And we, America, will help to Ukraine with creating these new jobs instead of this. And then, by the way, it was never done. So yes, Ukraine from those days became one of the first partners. But today, when Iran advanced so much in developing all these weapons and supports the world terror, we have to fight all this, and all what we are asking the free world not to help Iran, not to help him with the agreements, not to remove the sanctions, not to permit him to get access to the billions, but the very fate of Ukraine, the very fact that these two most dangerous dictatorships, Russia and Iran, are uniting their forces, are coordinating their activity, I believe it can help, because the free world already understood what an evil is Russia. And they are united in an unprecedented way in resisting to Russian aggression. So if Iran is becoming the main assistant partner of Russia, hopefully it will help to the free world to have stronger sanctions and delegitimization of Iranian regime.
There's another disturbing issue in all of this, which is essentially Holocaust denial and Nazis. Not only the desire to eradicate Israel by Iran as a political entity and as a Jewish state, but there is also an outright old school anti-Semitism that we have seen through Holocaust cartoons contacts in Iran. But at the same time, Russia has made openly anti-Semitic statements on the foreign ministry level. They have also compared Ukrainians to Nazis, and while also funding neo-Nazi groups all over Europe and elsewhere. How does this rhetoric play into the political discussions in Israel? Is that do they understand that Russia is at best only beholden by a mutually convenient agreement and would otherwise not be an ally to Israel outside the parameters of that particular agreement? Or is there a sense that it's just another country and there is not necessarily a big difference between Russia and other post-Soviet states?
Well, I think you will be surprised to hear, but as the one who is dealing a lot with the global anti-Semitism on the right, but also anti-Semitism on the left, delegitimizing of Jews and legitimizing the state of Israel, demonizing Jews and state of Israel. So dealing a lot, I would say that in the last years, the center of anti-Semitism moved from Eastern Europe to Western Europe. Mm-hmm. In Paris and in Brooklyn, mm-hmm. Jews going with the yarmulke, with the Jewishly dressed, feel themselves much more insecure than in Kiev or in Moscow. That really after the awful years of Soviet anti-Semitism, when Soviet Union fell apart, I would say Ukrainian leaders and Russian leaders were absolutely against supporting any type of anti-Semitism. Of course, there is always some prejudices among the people, but state anti-Semitism, which existed before 91 in Soviet Union, disappeared. And you will be even more surprised that I can tell that Vladimir Putin, with whom I met in his first years when he was not yet our president, when he was not yet such a dictator, and we were discussing with him many things, he told me he believes it was a mistake of Soviet Union not to let Jews independent life. He believes that Jewish community is something good for the state. And I have to say, though, with the years, we had more and more criticism. And I, as a human rights activist, was absolutely angry how he took control of the press and took control of the courts, and how KGB started entering the life of everyday life of Russian people. His promise to permit Jewish communities to develop, he kept. He has all types of stories how Jews helped him during his very difficult childhood, and that's why he has good attitude. But many anti-Semites have good stories about their childhood. But having said all this, he personally had a positive attitude to Jews, what is very rare for a Russian leader. But at the same time, of course, his desire was to build empire. And that is much more important to him, to develop relations with Syria and Iran, and to rebuild Russian empire than his attitude to one another nation. He's ready to sacrifice millions of his own Russian people. So what to think about Jews? And when the war starts, like this day, Jews are very often becoming a scapegoat. And we can see how from the very first days, anti-Semitism goes at the top, and no, not personally Putin, but his foreign minister, his people in his office start expressing absolutely anti-Semitic views. I think that's how the dictators always are looking for scapegoat when they are sending their own people to die. And there is no better scapegoat historically than Jews. So yes, with going back to totalitarian regime, Russia will be also going back to anti-Semitism. And it's not surprising that while, of course, the number of Jews who are coming now from Ukraine to Israel, who are moving from Ukraine, rises, but the number of Jews who are coming from Moscow, from Russia to Israel, goes 3-4 times even bigger, because Jews are really afraid now to be left behind the Iron Curtain and meet anti-Semitism when society will be absolutely closed. As to Ukraine, of course, there is no anti-Semitism. Whatever Russians are saying, I think it's the only country in the modern free world where openly, proudly Jewish person was elected in absolutely free elections with a lot of tough competition, was elected as a president. And he is now a very popular president. But also I can say from my experience working a lot with Jewish communities all over the world, yes, Jewish communities in Ukraine don't have any problems with the authorities. They're developing. Of course, today they suffer exactly as suffer all the Ukrainian people. They're part of the struggle.
I'm not sure about Israel, but in the United States, the anti-Zelensky propaganda from certain circles has been very potent. And to some extent, when there was this incident where he had an argument with some of the Israeli Knesset circles over the Holocaust and Ukrainian Holocaust and so forth, it was actually played up a great deal here in the Jewish communities and by the Jewish media, not so much by the American media that wasn't really paying that much attention, but by the Jewish media for sure. And there seems to be almost some people seem to be almost looking for some missteps of that sort. How would you address that whole issue now, looking back on what happened after some time has passed since that incident?
Yeah, well, look, I met President Zelensky only about 10 days ago. And I told him that just now I heard your great speech. He made a speech by Zoom in Tel Aviv, where he was getting some human rights award. And it was really very good speech. But I told him, not like your previous speech, which was also very good, but there was one phrase which was a huge mistake. And he immediately said, yeah, you mean what I said about Holocaust. So, and looking back, he understands that it was really a wrong phrase. And I remind you, in a very good and passionate appeal to to Israel and to Jewish people, at some moment he said, like during the Holocaust, Ukrainians were saving you. Now we expect that you will save Ukrainians. And that was a very wrong phrase. I have to say, I'm the chairman of the Babi Yar Memorial which building. Babi Yar is not only this symbol of Holocaust, it's by far the biggest mass grave of Holocaust. In 2 days, 34,000 people were killed. Altogether, 100,000 people were killed in Babi Yar. But it was also the symbol of the efforts of Soviet Union to raise the memory about Holocaust. So now in independent Ukraine, they cooperate with us in turning it into the biggest memorial and study center of Holocaust in Europe. And President Zelensky was personally involved in it. For example, during Corona, during Corona, 2 times I was on Zoom with him and his assistants discussing this project. And this project reminds us that, of course, it was Nazis who were killing Jews, but they were also collaborators among the Ukrainians who were helping them. But also there were 2,600 the great Ukrainians who were saving Jews. So let's say there were 10,000 who were assisting to Nazis, and there were 2,500 who were risking their own life saving Jews. So you cannot say about Ukrainian people that they were Nazis, but you cannot also say that we Ukrainian people were saving Jews. And in Israel, which is full of memory of Holocaust, and there are so many, practically most of the survivors from Holocaust are living and dying in Israel. So it was a mistake to say such a phrase. But as I was writing next day, and my daughter, by the way, who was also writing blogs, she was writing next day, she was saying, well, it was a misstep. You have to understand it was not said by some professor who is denying Holocaust. It was said by the commander-in-chief when his country is destroyed every day. He left the front for a few minutes, spoke passionately to Israelis, and came back to fight. So we have to understand, yes, it was a mistake. He himself understands that this phrase was misplaced, but he is the great fighter for not only for Ukraine, for the free world, and he deserves our full support.
Speaking of the free world, one of the issues that can make or break the making of democracy versus authoritarianism is the flow of funding. One of the first steps that were discussed as necessary, and they were not fully implemented even by the US, but at least in the beginning of the war, was the sanctioning of the oligarchs and various flows of financial support for Russia's operations abroad. A lot of these oligarchs some of these oligarchs had made previous donations to various Israeli institutions before the war, before they became personas non grata all over the world. Russia was already heading in an authoritarian direction. It already had a poor human rights record within its own borders, not to mention the 2014 invasion of Crimea. We've seen its actions in Georgia and so forth. To what extent has Israel and Israeli society looked at it as a real dilemma to struggle with? To what extent has it been, does it see liberalism and democracy outside its own borders as anything important to its strategic agenda? Given the fact that on the one hand, it needs financial support, but on the other hand, some of these people are linked to corruption and to human rights abuses somewhere else.
Well, first of all, of course, human rights, democracy, freedom, liberalism is not simply important to Israel. That's how Israel lives. That's the only democracy surrounded by all types of dictatorships, most of which want to destroy us. So to be part of the free world is as important for us as to be the only shelter for Jews from all over the world and that's why we call ourselves Jewish Democratic State. Now, financially, yeah, there were a period of time in the first years when we were dependent on world Jewry, when world Jewry was giving us more money than our budget. Today, all the assistance of all the Jews of the world is not even making 1% of the money which we have in our budget, which we produce of this in the state. Israel is extremely successful economical enterprise, and even in those today, if you look at the economy of the United States of America and Europe, you'll see how much more successful Israel is. So we don't depend on, but the philanthropy is a very important part of our life and part of America. You mentioned many oligarchs look at the best American universities, at Harvard, at Yale, and at Oxford in the United States, in the Britain, and you'll find that the same people who are giving few $1 million in Israel universities are giving 30, 40, $50 million in those universities. I even say more, why to speak only about Russia. The very rich people from Saudi Arabia, from Kuwait, are giving huge sums to American universities. And only now, American administration, a few years ago, they started following it, because it's really, we were drawing this attention. The fight against anti-Semitism, I was dealing with this a lot, how the Centers for Middle East Studies were financed by the worst dictators in the world, and were becoming center of anti-Semitic propaganda in American universities. So to get philanthropy from people who are not defending human rights was normal in this world, for good and for bad. Now, I just mentioned Babi Yar. I can say that initial money for this project came from Jews who were born in Ukraine, who lived in Russia, and who are under the rubric of Russian oligarchs. So it was normal part of the life of free world, for good and for bad. Now, when aggression of Putin started, it was natural that the world is looking to close all the sources of finance of that regime, and as a result, they put sanctions. After the war, we'll start clarifying who of the person, where it was justified and where it was not justified. During the war, they are trying to build it as broad as possible. But to think that that is the most effective way to cut the money to Putin is simply wrong. By far, the biggest 95, 97% of money which Putin gets today is still from the oil and gas which Putin is selling to the free world. And with all the sanctions, Putin is getting much more money from the free world than free world is putting into Ukrainian weapons. And that's something to think about. I know that it is a very difficult winter for the free world, but I believe that number one aim should be how to free world can produce more oil and more gas, and how to stop financing Russian war by buying neft and oil from oil and gas from Russia.
In the meantime, the same questions about liberalism and democracy that seem to be self-evident to the Israeli government are plaguing American society, American Jews, who are concerned about some of the allies Netanyahu has made in the course of the election process, and who are now in the government as leaders. In the government, I'm talking about specifically the religious Zionism party, and we're talking about Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. What is to be said about them, about their role? Do you foresee them having a big impact? Are they really what one would call Judaists, in the same way they're Islamists and the Christianists who seek to impose religious views through governance of society, or is it mostly election rhetoric? What should we be concerned?
Well, first of all, there is no reason to be concerned of what's happening in Israel, because as long as Israel is a liberal democratic society, it has enough institutions of its own not to permit something which is threatening to democracy. For example, in these elections, like in all the previous elections, there were complaints that some members of some parties are not democratic enough or not accepting the norms of liberal society. And Supreme Court was studying. And there's almost in every election, there is somebody who is prohibited to elections. And all those who are not prohibited are those who are acting in the framework of liberal democratic game. And these people were elected by absolutely free elections. One can say, okay, why right-wing and religious parties got so many votes? Well, there are two reasons. First reason is the constantly growing terrorist attacks. It was not written enough in the West, but in the last months, practically sometimes every day, but for sure every week, there were Israelis who were killed in the center of Israel because of terrorist attacks. And this feeling of the people that they are not secure enough and that the government is not making everything what has to be done to protect them, that's what strengthens those people who are speaking about more strong police and more tough rules of dealing with the terrorists and so on. So that's one reason. Another reason is poorly democratic. The previous government included many parties from left and center, Arabs and Jews, who were united only by one thing, not Bibi. And they were rejecting sitting the government with Bibi. And for some time it worked for 2 or 3 elections, which in fact finished in a draw between left and right, but it cannot be a platform. And so then people were very irritated with the fact that some of the parties who logically have to be partners with Bibi Netanyahu and Likud are refusing to sit with him in this government. So in the end, there were more, because people didn't want more elections. So they were voting over Likud, which is by far the biggest party in Israel, over those parties who said that they will accept to be in one government with Netanyahu. And practically all the parties who said that they will accept Netanyahu as prime minister, they are those who are now are forming the government. So is it good that it is so to right to the center? I would prefer that there will be some partners on the left from Bibi. And I believe that Bibi would like also very much to have it as a balance. But because these parties, before elections, were declaring publicly they will never go with Bibi, that's why don't vote for Bibi, it is difficult for them now to join coalition. I do hope that in a few months we'll see much broader coalition, because when it will become clear that Netanyahu's government will be stable and it has enough majority to be stable, they will join. So we'll have much broader government. That's what I hope. Now we'll see. It's not good that it is not balanced government, but there is one major moderate factor, and that's Prime Minister himself. He proved that in spite of all the criticism and all the suspicions, he never permitted to undermine the basic platform of Israel as a Jewish democratic state. So will there be pressure on him to change some of these basic principles? There will be pressure. Will he give up? I don't think he will give up.
There's been a growing concern, not so much about the political party coalition makeup, which I think is more of a reflection of the Israeli political system than the population as a whole, because people can only vote in the context of the structure that's given, but about the direction of religious parties in general. For instance, the Arab parties that were part of the previous coalition were outright Muslim Brotherhood. They were Islamist, maybe not the most extreme, but also clearly they had views that are well known. But there is also similar concern that some of the Jewish political parties are moving in an increasingly stringent direction and fundamentalist direction. How accurate is that, and what can be done to kind of bring together a dialogue that will prevent further polarization of the society on a religious basis?
Well, let me first address the fact that there was Arab party, which was fundamentalist Arab party in the previous government. First of all, I'm very much for participation of Arab parties in Israeli government. I believe it's important part of integration. After all, 20% of the population are Arabs. They vote for some of them, half of them is voting for specifically Arab parties. And at this moment, there are 3 parties, some more, there are less or more. And it's important that some of them will participate in the government, not only will be in the Knesset. In the Knesset, they always will, but to be in the government. But in Israel, exactly as the question of human rights is important, no less important is the fact of our existence as a Jewish democratic state. And you'll be surprised to know, but this party, Ram, which entered the government, was the first Arab party which said we accept Israel as a Jewish democratic state, and we are not going to fight against it. I believe that that is a minimal criteria which the government must have to accept somebody in the government. And the fact that it happened to be not Communist Party, Hadash, and not another secular party, which in fact was openly cooperating with the terrorists who tried to destroy Israel, but the religious party, which wants really to bring more religion into the life of Arabs. But the moment they accept the fact of existence and of Jewish democratic state and declare openly that we are not going to fight the state, we only want to improve conditions of the Arabs living in Israel, then I think they are eligible partners, and they should be partners. Being very critical about fundamentalism, at the same time was very glad that finally there is a party which accepts us as a Jewish state, and I was glad that they're in the government. And I do hope that in future we'll have more and more Arab parties in the government. Now, as to religious parties, I think, first of all, they constantly have a permanent number of seats in Knesset simply because there is part of Jewish population for who have Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox way of life. And they have the same right to vote as everybody. And they're permanently voting for Aguda and some of them for Shas. This year, there were at least 2 or 3 mandates more than in the previous elections. And also there is reason for this. There were some secular parties, and Avigdor Lieberman's party, who had a vicious campaign against religion, against religious parties. And it scared many of them. Many of them felt that we must have strong protection for our religious life. And that what gave another 2 or 3 mandates. Is it healthy? No, it's not healthy when it goes to one extreme or to the other extreme. But again, I say, because Israel is the real democracy, and because we have Knesset, government, and also Supreme Court, each of these bodies are very strong. In fact, Knesset and Supreme Court are stronger than the government, what's natural. So I think that all our developments will continue as a part of democratic game, will continue in the borders of liberalism and democracy. So I would not be concerned. And anyway, we have to give time to this government to start making steps, and then we will judge. I don't think that there is a real threat to democracy in Israel.
Leaving aside the question of the government, we have seen another concerning development in the past couple of years, which is Hamas interference with some of the Israeli Arab communities in attempts to incite and divide some of the segments of that population, and we have seen the riots that took place as a result during Ramadan and on other occasions. What can the Israelis do to prevent further infiltration of these elements into society? Why have they become successful after decades of not being able to penetrate Israel as a society? Why are they succeeding now?
Well, I'm not sure that they're really succeeding. In fact, what happened in the last year and a half shows that Israel can successfully fight it.
Mhm.
But it's true, it's very concerning. In fact, Israel had to do two things: to be much more tough on the enemies,
Mhm.
and to much more large to those who want to be integral part of it. That's why I believe that Arab Party entering the government and demanding more budgets to infrastructure Arab towns is a very positive step. And no doubt that developing or improving conditions, encouraging more and more higher education, more and more coexistence, more and more Arab doctors in the hospitals and the teachers in the schools and so on, that helps. At the same time, we must be very tough even with those, even if it is few elements supporting terror and extremism among our population, among our citizens. We are so busy fighting with terror groups outside the borders that we paid not enough attention to the fact how they penetrate into our cities. So I think, and by the way, that was one of the reasons why this right-wing camp won these elections, because that is exactly the time between the previous election and these elections. That's the time when people start feeling themselves less secure in our own towns. And in all those towns where there is mixed Jewish Arab population, whether it is in Akko, whether it is in Lod, suddenly there are some cells of terror. And so yes, the results of elections demand of the people to have much more tough hand on these terror groups. On the other hand, it's absolutely clear to everybody that for all those who want to live in peace and to be an integral part of our country, we have to do everything that they will have equal rights and the same type of environment and infrastructure and services as our Jewish population.
Finally, there's one question I'd be remiss if I did not ask with regards to this framework of liberalism, of democracy, and the directions that we are seeing, and that is the dialogue on these issues with the American Jewish community, which on the one hand has very strong relationship with the state of Israel, but on the other hand has very much its own dynamic, and there's been a lot of differences, but I would say also more importantly, which are natural, but there's also been a lot of miscommunication. The American Jewish population is overwhelmingly left-leaning, overwhelmingly secular, and this is always a growing concern. But assimilation and some level of acceptance of growing expressions of anti-Semitism in as a result of general political polarization in U.S. society, there's also concern about the distancing of the American Jewish community from Israel and from Israel population, and a complete lack of integrated discussions on major issues that are of concern to both of them. How do you see this playing out? Is there anything anyone can do, and who should be doing it?
Well, as you probably understand, as the activist of Jewish diaspora and later the head of Jewish agency, I dealt and deal a lot with the relations between Israel and Jewish communities. And first of all, I have to say that the relations are very deep and interdependence is very deep. The increasing number of Jews, even in those days, even during Corona, but definitely in the normal days, increasing number of young Jews, tens and tens of thousands every year, are coming to Israel to strengthen their Jewish identity. They are of all types of religiosity, left and the right, but they understand that connection with Israel is very important part of their identity. On the other hand, Israel is spending more and more means and using its tools to fight anti-Semitism, to protect Jewish communities, to to help them to build institutions, whether it is summer camps, whether it is Jewish schools, and so on. So there is a lot of connection. At the same time, the question, are we converging or diverging, is the question which is asked from both sides all the time. And as I and Gil Troy wrote in our last book, Never Alone, about which all is about dialogue between diaspora and Israel. It will take American Jews and Israel, in spite of this feeling of one family. Our grandfathers are coming from the same places. And, there is a lot of interconnection, historical, political, social, religious, and so on. We are living in a very different surrounding. Israelis are those who chose to live in Jewish state, Jewish democratic state around dictatorships. And number one question for us is the need of survival and fighting for survival. Jews of America, coming from the same background, chose to live in the free democratic society where their number one challenge is how to survive, how not to be assimilated, how not to disappear. And they know, on one hand, they know that to fight anti-Semitism historically, you must support very liberal forces, because the moment the liberalism is shrinking or human rights are shrinking, Jews are the first to feel it. So it is very important for them, liberal, democratic type of their society. On the other hand, how in this freely assimilating society not to disappear as people. With all the importance of these agendas for one another, it's not the same agenda. And that's why Israelis are always, not always, very often are angry why a question of our security is less important for them than the question of human rights. And they are angry why Jewish values of human rights, liberal values, are less important for you than the war. And that is the base of this disagreement. Having said all this, I think there are so many things where we are interdependent, where we, and then we do know that they as a Jewish people in liberal society, and we as a Jewish state surrounded by dictatorships, we can survive only together. And that's the historical path which we started together and we will continue together. So yes, there are a lot of disagreements, but a lot of mutual concerns. For example, anti-Semitism on the right and on the left, which is growing in America, which is growing practically in every campus. I'm dealing with this almost every day. I'm getting reports about what's happening in American campuses. And these concerns of the growing anti-Semitism are our mutual concerns, and concerns about Israel's survival vis-a-vis Iranian threats are mutual concerns. So in the end, things which are connecting us are stronger than disagreements and priorities which each of groups puts for themselves.
Thank you so much. This was very, very much enlightening, and and I find myself feeling a lot more hopeful for everything in general after talking with you, which is you've been through a lot, but yet you managed to retain a very positive, very forward-looking, and very proactive point of view, and I hope that is the biggest takeaway for our listeners from this discussion.
Thank you. For those who are pessimistic, first of all, there is no sense in being pessimistic, but I propose you simply to look where we were 30 years ago, and where we were 100 years ago, and where we were 200 years ago. And we'll see how our life is improving all the time. And if I didn't lose hope, even being in prison and the sentence or the threat of being sentenced to death, we have all the reasons to be optimistic in these difficult struggles which free world has, but we have all the tools to win in this struggle. Thank you.
Thank you so much for everyone joining us. This was Natan Sharansky we were discussing Israel and its relationship to Russia and Ukraine, and of course, in the broader sense, the importance of human rights, democracy, liberalism, and where it's all going. For those joining us, we will be meeting same time next week, Tuesday, 9 p.m. And video was the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider, Irina Zuckerman. Thank you and have a good night.